This is the Battle of Adwa, the last time Ethiopia was invaded by a European power. It kicked them all the way back to Italy. Join us as we explain why this battle was so important for Africa. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia was not the first attempt by a European power to conquer Ethiopia. In 1896, an expeditionary force from the British Empire attempted to occupy Ethiopia but failed at the Battle of Adwa. But Britain's policy towards Ethiopia changed after the discovery of gold, platinum, tungsten, and other valuable minerals in the region. This made Ethiopia very important to the British economically. But they also realized that to control this source of wealth, they would need the help of another great power, Italy. To cover the retreat of his right wing, General Nasibu held his position near the town of Adwa, giving the rest of the Ethiopian army time to escape. He repeatedly asked for reinforcements, but none came, and so he and his men fought to the death. Despite their defeat, the British continued to support the Italians because they were still a threat to the Ottoman Empire. They also had the backing of Germany, who both saw the Ethiopian campaign as a chance to weaken the British. However, the Italians had better technology and eventually overwhelmed the Ethiopian forces. But this was only after inflicting heavy casualties. By now, the Italians had more men than the Ethiopians, 170,000 versus 110,000. After the Battle of Adwa, Haile Selassie was hailed as a national hero and many Africans began looking to him as the leader of the African continent. While he did try to form alliances with other African nations, these attempts ultimately failed. But the Italians also had to contend with malaria and the rugged terrain. He then launched a program of modernization and reform, including the introduction of a new written language, a modern military, and a new constitution, which ultimately resulted in the Ethiopian Revolution of 1975. After the revolution, Haile Selassie's body was exhumed and many people believed that he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Britain gained control of Italian Somaliland, while France took over Italian Ethiopia, much to the resentment of the Ethiopian people. Today, he is still revered by some as the Messiah and he has followers in Jamaica and other parts of the world. Nevertheless, Ethiopia continued to be a thorn in the side of the British as the Ethiopians harbored many anti-colonial guerrillas who regularly crossed into British Somaliland to regroup. This led to the Ogaden War between Somalia and Ethiopia, which ended with the withdrawal of Somali troops from Ethiopian territory. Although there were still many European colonies left on the continent, the Europeans realized that they could no longer count on easy victories. From this point forward, any European power that wished to conquer Africa would have to do so with superior force. And so the Italians established their camp far from the front lines to keep their troops healthy. As the Italians advanced into the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, the Ethiopians prepared to make their final stand at a town called Adwa. The Europeans respected the Africans and would not dare treat them as inferiors. It was the first time that a European power had been defeated by an African army. This shattered the myth of European superiority and helped to pave the way for decolonization movements around the world. It represents the courage and determination of the Ethiopian people to defend their homeland and from foreign invaders. The battle is commemorated every year in Ethiopia on March 2nd and is a reminder of the importance of fighting for freedom and independence. It established the country as a modern nation-state and marked the beginning of a new era of independence. But after the battle, Haile Selassie was able to centralize power and to modernize the country. So when Mussolini threatened war over Ethiopia, Britain refused to help, hoping that Italy would exhaust itself fighting against the Ethiopians. However, the French were not interested in ruling over Ethiopia, and so they invited the British to administer the country instead. This lasted for 5 years until Ethiopia was finally able to gain independence once again. In fact, Ethiopia became the only African country to never be colonized by a European power. The Ethiopians were able to defeat an army with modern rifles and artillery using nothing but spears and shields. This showed that it was possible for an African army to win against a European power. They were well-trained and had good leadership. And so in 1935, when Italy decided to try again, the British did nothing to stop them. And the US President Franklin D. Roosevelt even invited Ethiopia's emperor, Haile Selassie, to visit the White House. However, this never happened because Haile Selassie refused to recognize the State of Israel. In fact, the British openly supported the Italian invasion, which may have seemed like a surprise to the Ethiopians who had fought against the British just 40 years earlier. Italy was one of the most industrialized countries in Europe with a strong army and navy. Ethiopia was able to hold out for some time due to its rugged terrain and the bravery of its people. On March 2, 1936, the Ethiopian army led by Emperor Haile Selassie set up camp near the town of Adwa, about 20 miles from the Italian lines. Both sides exchanged artillery fire for 2 days until finally the Italians advanced on march. Meanwhile, the rest of the Ethiopian army retreated to safety, having covered themselves in glory. The next day, the Italians entered the town of Adwa and found it deserted. They later discovered Nasibu's body, killed while defending his post. The Italians had won a great victory, but it was not the decisive victory they had hoped for. Mussolini was furious with General Diaz for failing to capture Selassie and ordered him to finish the job. But the general refused, saying that it would take another 6 months and 100,000 men. With the Battle of Adwa, the Italians had suffered heavy casualties, including almost half of their officers. And they couldn't afford to lose any more men. And so the Italians occupied the Ethiopian capital and set up a puppet government while continuing to fight the guerrillas who harassed their supply lines. At this point, Mussolini was ready to declare victory and return home, but Hitler convinced him to wait a few more months. After the Battle of Adwa, the Ethiopians regrouped and continued to resist the Italians, launching surprise attacks and ambushes. The Italians suffered greatly from diseases common in the area, and their supply situation grew worse as the rainy season made the roads impassable. Mussolini wanted to end the conflict before the rainy season began, but his generals advised him to wait until the end of the year to launch a new offensive. However, the British now entered the war and the Italians were forced to abandon their offensive and defend instead. However, Haile Selassie was not interested in leading a Pan-African movement. He was simply interested in reclaiming his throne. After 5 years of exile, Haile Selassie returned to Ethiopia in 1941 and promptly executed all of his rivals, real or imagined. But his rule was increasingly challenged by ethnic and religious tensions. After the Battle of Adwa, Italy was stripped of its East African colonies, and the victorious allies divided the spoils. Ethiopia became known as French Ethiopia and was put under the administration of the French colonial empire. During World War II, Ethiopia was seen as a potential ally of the British. Following the war, Ethiopia was readmitted to the League of Nations, but its relations with Britain were strained after Britain supported the establishment of Israel. To prevent this, the British invaded Ethiopia and installed a pro-British monarchy. However, the Ethiopians were able to defeat them and force them to withdraw. The Battle of Adwa marked the end of European colonialism in Africa. After the Battle of Adwa, there were no more rebellions on the scale of the Maji-Maji Rebellion or the Ashanti Wars. In addition to ending European colonialism in Africa, the Battle of Adwa also had a major impact on Ethiopian history. Prior to the battle, Ethiopia had been a loose collection of semi-autonomous states. In the aftermath of the battle, the Ethiopians were able to repel future Italian invasions and preserve their independence. The Battle of Adwa also had a major impact on the international stage. In addition, the battle demonstrated the military prowess of the Ethiopian army. Finally, the Battle of Adwa is an important symbol of African resistance to colonialism. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on our future videos. Thank you for watching. This is the Ethiopian victory at Adwa. This victory not only helped to end Italian colonialism in Africa, but it also had massive effects on every other African independence movement against European colonial powers. So let me tell you why. Welcome to my channel, where we bring you the untold stories of Africa. And today, we are talking about the Ethiopian victory at Adwa. The Ethiopians were led by Menelik II, who was known for his brilliant military strategies. The Italians, on the other hand, were led by an Italian general named Orestes Salati. Now, although they had more men, their army was ill-equipped and suffered from low morale. You see, at the time, most of Africa was colonized by Europeans. Only Liberia and Ethiopia were free. So when the Ethiopians won at Adwa, it gave hope to those who wanted to end colonialism. For example, the soldiers had to carry their ammunition in backpacks instead of specialized equipment. This alliance was formed in 1923 by representatives from Ethiopia, Egypt, Libya, and Morocco. Its purpose was to promote cooperation among African and Arab nations and to oppose European colonialism. For example, it provided financial and military aid to the Ethiopian patriots who were fighting against Italian occupation. However, despite these efforts, the alliance was unable to prevent the partition of Africa among the European powers. The alliance also provided a forum for leaders from across Africa to meet and discuss strategies for ending colonialism. It was kept alive by individuals like Kwame Nkrumah, who went on to become the first president of Ghana. He established cultural centers and supported the works of writers, musicians, and filmmakers who depicted the struggles and triumphs of African people. He also made significant contributions to education and healthcare. Nkrumah believed that investing in human capital was essential for the development of Africa. He established universities, hospitals, and clinics to improve access to education and healthcare for Ghanaians and Africans across the continent. These initiatives helped to alleviate poverty and empower individuals to improve their lives. These cultural initiatives helped to foster a sense of pride and identity among Africans and inspired them to work towards a united and independent Africa. It demonstrated the potential for African nations to resist and defeat European colonial powers, inspiring future generations of freedom fighters across the continent. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. The Ethiopian victory at Adwa was a pivotal moment in African history. It demonstrated the potential for African nations to resist and defeat European colonial powers, inspiring future generations of freedom fighters across the continent. Others have praised him for his commitment to Pan-Africanism and his efforts to promote unity and independence among African nations. Some argue that it was a decisive moment in African history that inspired generations of freedom fighters. It demonstrated the possibility of defeating a European colonial power and inspired other Africans to fight for their own independence. The victory also had a profound impact on the personal lives of those who fought and died at Adwa. Many of the soldiers who fought in the battle were young men who had never seen an Italian before. Yet they were willing to give their lives to defend their country against this foreign invader. The bravery and sacrifice of these men and women should not be forgotten. Others suggest that its impact was overstated and that other factors were more important in ending colonialism in Africa. This organization was founded in 1963 with the aim of promoting unity and solidarity among African states. Nkrumah believed that by working together, African countries could overcome the economic challenges they faced as a result of colonialism. He pushed for the creation of a common market and the adoption of a single currency to facilitate trade within Africa. One of its main objectives was to liberate African countries that were still under colonial rule. Under Nkrumah's leadership, the OAU provided financial, military, and diplomatic support to liberation movements across the continent. For example, it assisted the Angolans in their struggle against Portuguese colonialism and the South Africans in their fight against apartheid. Nkrumah was a staunch supporter of Pan-Africanism, a movement that called for the unity of all African people. He believed that Africa should be self-governing and independent of European powers. And after gaining independence for Ghana, he worked tirelessly to help other African nations achieve the same goal. And it wasn't just the military victory that impressed Africans, it was also the use of modern weapons. You see, the Ethiopians used rifles, artillery, and machine guns to defeat the Italians. And this showed Africans that it was possible to win against better armed colonial powers. Plus, many of them were volunteers who didn't even speak Italian. They organized political parties, newspapers, and trade unions to promote their cause. And in some cases, they even took up arms to fight for freedom. For example, in Kenya, the Kikuyu people launched the Mau Mau Rebellion against British rule. For example, Ethiopia and Egypt had long been rivals for influence in the region. Additionally, the alliance was weakened by the rise of fascist Italy in the 1930s. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935, Egypt and Libya refused to come to Ethiopia's aid. Nevertheless, the alliance survived and played an important role in the independence of African nations during the post-war period. Similarly, in Ghana, the Gold Coast, as it was then called, became the first British colony in Africa to gain independence in 1957. In fact, the leader of the independence movement in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, even attended Menelik's funeral in 1913. He was that inspired by him. The result was an army that was poorly trained and couldn't fight in cohesion. But first things first, this is me. In 1896, a small nation held off an invading force of over 170,000 men. It all started when Menelik sent a small force to intercept an Italian supply train. The Italians, under the command of General Boldisera, tried to stop the Ethiopians, but they were defeated. This victory gave Menelik the chance to lure the main Italian force into a trap. When the Italians arrived at Adwa, they were exhausted and in low spirits. Meanwhile, the Ethiopians were well rested and eager to fight. Their elite army consisted of infantry, cavalry, and artillery units. Plus, Menelik was a genius strategist who used guerrilla tactics to defeat the Italians. He knew that his army was smaller than the Italian force, so he avoided direct confrontations. Instead, he lured the Italians into the rugged Ethiopian highlands where they suffered from altitude sickness. Then he launched surprise attacks when the Italians were weak and exhausted. So how did the Ethiopians beat them? Well, Ethiopia had a strong military tradition dating back centuries. The turning point of the war came at the Battle of Adwa. In addition to ending Italian colonialism in Ethiopia, the victory at Adwa also inspired other Africans who were fighting for independence from European powers. You see, news of the Ethiopian victory spread quickly throughout Africa. Now, after the Battle of Adwa, many Africans began to demand independence from their colonial rulers. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the victory at Adwa was the creation of the Afro-Asiatic Alliance, also known as the Pan-African Congress. However, the alliance faced a number of challenges. For one thing, the members were rivals as well as allies. In addition to its diplomatic efforts, the alliance also supported armed resistance against colonial rule. But the dream of African liberation didn't die with the Afro-Asian Alliance. Nkrumah also played a key role in the formation of the Organization of African Unity, also known as the OAU. In addition to supporting liberation movements, the OAU also sought to promote economic cooperation among African nations. In addition to his diplomatic efforts, Nkrumah also encouraged African intellectuals and artists to celebrate their heritage and promote Pan-Africanism through their work. But it wasn't just in diplomacy and politics that Nkrumah's influence was felt. Despite his many accomplishments, Nkrumah's legacy has been a controversial one. Some have criticized him for being a dictator who suppressed dissent and violated human rights. And the legacy of Ethiopia's victory at Adwa continues to be debated. Despite the controversies, there is no doubt that the Ethiopian victory at Adwa was a significant event in African history. Ethiopia's victory at Adwa was a pivotal moment in African history. If you like this video, You might also enjoy another video we did about the amazing Queen of Sheba. What strategic mistakes did the Italian forces make during the Battle of Adwa? Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. It's me from a history channel, and we're still in Africa and in the 1800s, but this time we are going to look at the Battle of Adwa. That was the goal. The Italians had around 17,000 men, while the Ethiopians were estimated between 60 and 100,000 men. So the Italians were definitely outnumbered. Despite being outnumbered, the Italians wanted to attack and defeat the Ethiopian army, and that was the intelligence. So the Italians had been in Ethiopia for almost 2 decades at this point, so since 1882, yet they still massively underestimated the Ethiopians. For example, they had no idea how many troops were actually facing them or even where those troops were coming from. They also failed to recognize that the Ethiopian troops weren't all infantry. So the Italians had chosen the site for the battle because they had the high ground. It was a little hill, but it gave them an advantage over the Ethiopians. And the Italians knew that, but they kind of wasted it. They wanted to defeat them on the field, crush their army, and conquer Ethiopia. And to do that, they needed a plan, and they didn't really have one. So those were their intelligence, their artillery, the overall tactics, not using the high ground and not using their cavalry. Let me know in the comments below if you think there were any other mistakes or if you have any other thoughts about the battle. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with others. Remember to subscribe for new videos every week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Their plan basically consisted of shooting the Ethiopians as they came through the pass and then using their cavalry to mop up the survivors. And that was it. They didn't have any sort of coordinated plan. And this is one of the big advantages that the Ethiopians had. The Ethiopians had actual military training. They had real military doctrine. So when they went into battle, they knew what they were doing. They had a plan. So the Italians, by trying to go head-to-head with them, they kind of played right into the Ethiopian plan. So the Italians didn't have any tactics. They didn't have any real strategy for this battle. The Italians set up their guns and most of their troops on the high ground. Now that isn't a lot compared to the size of the army, but that isn't a small force either. It's a significant amount of troops, but the Italians saved most of their cavalry for the end of the battle. They didn't bring it up when they needed it. When the battle started, the Italians had around 8,000 men in the front line with about 4,000 in reserve. And these guys were all armed with rifles, so they weren't necessarily the best troops. They were regular infantrymen, but they had guns. Then the Italians had another 2,000 troops who were armed with shotguns. These guys were the black shirts, fascist party members who were volunteers in the army. And behind them were the 400 cavalrymen. So the Italians waited until the end of the battle to use their cavalry. They wanted to use it to mop up the remaining Ethiopians. However, they never got the chance because the Ethiopians attacked them and routed them before they ever got into the fight. The cavalry was essential to the Italian plan, and without it, their plan fell apart. Also, they should have used their cavalry sooner, but they saved it for too long and it never got used. But they left the right flank exposed, and they didn't utilize the high ground to its maximum potential. For example, they didn't use the high ground to direct artillery fire onto the oncoming Ethiopians. Like I said, they only brought one gun, but if they had used the high ground properly, they could have directed some serious artillery barrages against the Ethiopians as they came up the hillside. But the one gun that they did bring was actually positioned in a very advantageous spot and did cause casualties among the oncoming Ethiopians, but it was not enough. Also, the Italians had a tendency to bunch up their troops to close together. They didn't spread out along the high ground. They kind of put most of their troops on top of each other. And this caused problems when the Ethiopians launched their attack because they got surrounded and they weren't able to move. So the Italians had the high ground, but they didn't use it to its full potential. They also had cavalry and artillery, and because they didn't know that, They didn't prepare for it. And the reason they didn't bring more was because of the terrain. They figured that because they were in such a mountainous area, they wouldn't be able to use more than one gun. But that was a mistake because they needed more guns. But also, even the one gun that they brought wasn't set up correctly. It was set up on a slight decline, and this caused the barrel to crack and break, and it couldn't be used for the rest of the battle. Even if they had brought more guns, that probably wouldn't have solved the problem because the gunners weren't very experienced. Actually, they were mostly just conscripts who were pulled from the colonial troops in Eritrea and Somalia. They weren't experienced gunners, so if they had more guns, they still wouldn't have been able to use them effectively. But bringing some more guns wouldn't have hurt. They just assumed that they were facing regular infantry. So General Bariati chose a site near the town of Adwa for his ambush. They had regular telegraph lines throughout the Ethiopian countryside, and that allowed them to communicate across the front line. But what they didn't do was use those communications to gather intelligence. So even though they had set up those phone lines throughout the country, they didn't use them to call up local administrators, local chiefs, and ask them what was going on, what was happening in the area. They also didn't use any spies. They didn't even use local informants. So even though they had a huge communications network, they didn't really use it to gather intelligence. They should have known that a large force was coming to meet them because the Ethiopians had been marching across the country for months to get to this location. So maybe if the Italians had used their telegraphs more efficiently, they could have known that a large force was coming to meet them. He expected the Ethiopians to come through this pass, and he would then be able to attack them with his superior firepower and his cavalry. You want to find out as much about your enemy as possible. And the best way to do that is to capture some of them and ask them questions. The Italians had already captured several hundred Ethiopians before the battle, but they released them, and that could have been a mistake. Maybe if they had held some of those prisoners and interrogated them, they might have gotten some valuable information that could have helped them out during the battle. However, the Ethiopian commander, Ras Makonnen, knew these passes very well, and instead of going through the pass, he went around it. So the Italians did not get the advantage they were hoping for. This was the battle where the Italians were defeated by the Ethiopians. Now, I have done a few videos about the Battle of Adwa, but none specifically looking at the Italian side. So let us get into what I think were the 5 biggest strategic mistakes that the Italians made during the battle. Okay, so let's just quickly recap what happened here. So the Italians were sent out by the Italians to conquer Ethiopia. And because they didn't set up the gun correctly, it broke down and was not available for the rest of the battle. If they had artillery support, I think the Italians would have had a much better chance. Instead, they relied on their rifles and their cavalry. The rifles were pretty good, but those rifles couldn't elevate, which meant that the soldiers were essentially sitting ducks when the Ethiopian snipers started picking them off. As for the cavalry, the Italians thought they would be able to sweep the battlefield after they broke the Ethiopian infantry, but they didn't bring enough. So there wasn't enough cavalry for everyone. Also, the cavalry wasn't very good because most of those soldiers who volunteered for the cavalry were actually volunteers from Eritrea and Somalia who weren't very well trained. The other problem for the Italians was their artillery. They only brought one gun to this battle. So let's get into the first strategic mistake that I think the Italians made. One thing that the Italians did right was setting up an extensive network of telephone lines. And this is one area where the Italians actually excelled. Another thing the Italians didn't do was take prisoners. And this is something that all militaries do. You want to capture enemy soldiers. Okay, so the second big strategic mistake was not taking better advantage of the high ground. Okay, the third big mistake was with their artillery again. So like I said, the Italians only brought one gun to this battle. Alright, the fourth mistake was with their tactics. So the Italians had decided to fight a decisive battle with the Ethiopians. Okay, the fifth and final mistake I want to talk about was the cavalry. So the Italians had around 400 cavalrymen. Okay, so those were the 5 mistakes that I think the Italians made during the Battle of Adwa. On this day in history, March 2nd, 1896, the Ethiopian army defeated an invading Italian force at the Battle of Adwa. This victory is considered a founding moment of Pan-Africanism. So why is that? Why is the Battle of Adwa considered a symbol of Pan-Africanism and resistance? Well, for starters, the battle pitted an African army against a European colonial power. Now, by the late 19th century, Europeans had carved up almost all of Africa among themselves. Ethiopia, however, managed to preserve its independence. But while the battle itself was over in a few hours, its consequences would reverberate throughout the continent of Africa and beyond for decades to come. So how exactly did the Battle of Adwa become a symbol of Pan-Africanism? And so it was one of the only African nations that wasn't colonized. In his official account of the battle, he wrote, "We must make our victory resound like the thunder of 1,000 drums from Cape Town to Cairo." The battle became a rallying cry for Africans across the continent who were living under the yoke of European colonialism. Leaders such as Webb Du Bois and Kwame Nkrumah used the example of Ethiopia and its victory over Italy to argue that Africans could win their freedom through armed struggle. Firstly, it disproved the myth of European racial superiority. It was a victory against racism. Webb Du Bois also spoke about the importance of the battle. He said that the victory at Adwa was an inspiration to all Africans and people of African descent all over the world. He said it showed us that we had the ability to resist oppression and fight for our freedom. Secondly, it showed that Africans could win their freedom through armed struggle. And thirdly, it helped create a sense of unity among Africans. It's a source of national pride for the Ethiopian people. But I think it is fair to say that the battle has had an even greater impact on the world as a whole. It inspired generations of people to fight against oppression and for the right to self-determination. It created a sense of shared identity and purpose that would form the basis of the Pan-African movement. I would also like to encourage you all to subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss out on any of my videos. And finally, I would like to invite you all to follow me on social media, where I share all kinds of cool stuff. So yeah, that is it for today. Thank you all so much once again for watching, and I shall catch you all next time. Of course, the reality was far more complicated than that. The struggle for African independence was long and bloody, and it would take decades before most African nations would win their freedom. But the victory at Adwa gave Africans hope that they could indeed beat back the European colonial powers. He realized that the victory at Adwa wasn't just an Ethiopian victory, it was a victory for all Africans. By defeating an Italian invasion force, Menelik had defended all of Africa from European colonization. And so it is no surprise that the Battle of Adwa is often referred to as the battle that stopped colonialism. News of the battle reached Europe several months after it had happened because the Europeans who had been stationed in Ethiopia had cut the telegraph lines as they retreated. But when news of the Ethiopian victory finally did reach the rest of the world, people were astounded. Before Adwa, there had been no Pan-African movement. The various African groups that would come together to form the Pan-African movement after Adwa simply hadn't met each other yet, or they had met, but were still suspicious of one another. Adwa changed all of that. For the first time, Africans from all over the continent came together in one place, the Congress of Berlin in 1896, to discuss the problems facing their people and to formulate a plan to address them. At this Congress, the leaders of the emerging Pan-African movement began the process of creating a sense of common identity among Africans. They identified the main obstacles to African progress as colonialism and racism, and they resolved to work toward ending both. Thus, the Congress of Berlin is considered the birthplace of Pan-Africanism. The idea of an African army defeating a European one was just too much for people to believe. You see, at that time, Europeans believed that they were racially superior to non-Europeans, that they were destined to rule over the rest of humanity. They called this destiny the white man's burden. It was their duty to lord over the inferior Africans and other non-Europeans. And this belief in white supremacy was what allowed European powers to dominate and exploit the rest of the world. But if Africans were able to defeat Europeans in battle, then that meant that there was no racial basis for the claim of European superiority. If Africans could fight back and win, then they, too, could aspire to greatness and rule themselves. The victory at Adwa dealt a death blow to the myth of European invincibility. It proved that Africans were not a people that should be messed with. They completely routed the Italians, killing or wounding two-thirds of their soldiers. There was, of course, the Maji rebellion in German East Africa, which we covered yesterday. And there were many other examples that we haven't covered here on this channel. But those rebellions had failed. The Battle of Adwa, however, was different. It wasn't just a desperate attempt by an oppressed people to fight back against their oppressors. It was a meticulously planned and executed military campaign. Menelik II had known for years that a European power would try to invade and colonize Ethiopia. So he had spent years preparing for such an eventuality. He modernized the Ethiopian army, introducing new weapons and training methods. He also forged alliances with former enemies of Ethiopia, such as the Omotic peoples. All of this preparation paid off in a major way. Among the dead was the Italian general, the man leading the invasion force, General Baratieri. He was killed by a spear-wielding Ethiopian warrior. In fact, some sources say he was killed by Mangasha, the son of the Ethiopian Emperor Menelik II. The Italians fled in all directions. Many of them would later be captured and killed by the Ethiopians. The Ethiopian casualties were much lower, around 4,000 men compared to the Italians' 5,000 dead and wounded. Menelik declared victory, and soon afterward his forces began to pursue the retreating Italians. It would remain the only African nation free of European colonization until the independence of Ghana in 1957. So that alone made Ethiopia a beacon of hope for Africans across the continent who were living under the brutal reign of European colonial powers. The Italians, you see, had already colonized large parts of North Africa, including modern-day Libya and Somalia, which they had taken from the Ottoman Empire just a few years prior. But now they wanted to expand their empire into Ethiopia. Their invasion force consisted of 17,000 troops, half of whom were indigenous Muslim Somalis from their colony in Somalia, who they had forcibly recruited as porters and askaris or irregular troops. The Ethiopians also had about 17,000 soldiers, but these were all volunteers, men who had come together out of a sense of patriotism and a desire to defend their homeland and from foreign domination. The Ethiopians also had better weapons, more rifles and artillery. But despite having these advantages, the Italians were still confident of victory. After all, European armies were considered invincible by Africans and other non-Europeans. The Italians thought they could steamroll the Ethiopians like they had done with every other African tribe they had encountered. But they severely underestimated the Ethiopians and their determination to resist colonization. The battle itself was a decisive victory for the Ethiopians. It was a humiliating defeat for Italy and a glorious victory for Ethiopia. Well, firstly, the mere fact that the Ethiopians had won against a European power sent shock waves across the continent and the world. Now, this wasn't the first time that Africans had fought back against European colonizers. Another reason why the Battle of Adwa became a symbol of Pan-Africanism, because Menelik understood that his victory would have repercussions far beyond Ethiopia. In fact, Pan-Africanist leaders of the early 20th century used the victory at Adwa to help advance their cause. Finally, the last reason why the Battle of Adwa became a symbol of Pan-Africanism is because it created a sense of unity among Africans. So in conclusion, the Battle of Adwa became a symbol of Pan-Africanism for several reasons. As Kwame Nkrumah put it, the victory of Adwa was a victory for all Africa. It was a victory against imperialism. It was a victory against colonialism. Of course, the significance of Adwa goes beyond Pan-Africanism. The battle is a key part of Ethiopian history. Anyway, that is it for today. As always, I would like to thank you all so much for watching. The Battle of Adwa, fought in 1896 between Ethiopia and an Italian invasion force, is often regarded as one of the most important battles of the 19th century. This Ethiopian victory stopped an European power from colonizing Africa. But before the Ethiopians could defeat the Italians, they had to prepare for the battle. So how did Emperor Menelik II prepare his troops? Let's find out. Emperor Menelik II came to power in 1889 after the death of his father, Emperor John IV. At these camps, soldiers were taught how to read maps, shoot rifles, and use artillery. Prior to Menelik's reign, the Ethiopian army used spears, swords, and shields. The Italians had also been training for years and had even done a little bit of fighting before they reached Ethiopia. The Blackshirts were Italian soldiers who had volunteered to fight in the African campaign. These soldiers were highly trained and well-equipped. They hoped that the Ethiopian army would try to stop them, and then they would defeat them in open battle. The Italians' first major engagement was at the Battle of Adwa. They were armed with the same weapons as the regular Italian army, and many of them had seen combat in previous wars. So get ready to find out how the Battle of Adwa went down next week. Also, if you want to find out about other important battles of the past, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. The Askari were native African soldiers who had been recruited in Italian East Africa. These soldiers were not as well trained or equipped as the Blackshirts, but they made up for it with their knowledge of the terrain. So let us take a look at how the Italians tried to conquer Ethiopia and what kind of army they had. But the Italians were armed with the latest rifles and artillery, so the Ethiopians had to be equipped with similar weapons. Menelik started by buying weapons from Russia and France. He purchased 30,000 rifles and 12 million rounds of ammunition from the Russians and 20,000 rifles and 400 guns from the French. However, he soon realized that buying weapons from European powers wasn't sustainable in the long term, so he started making Ethiopia's own weapons. He set up a gunpowder factory, a rifle factory, and a shell factory. With these factories, the Ethiopian army was able to produce its own weapons and ammunition. One interesting weapon produced by the Ethiopian arsenal was a curved sword called the shat. The shat was developed by Ethiopian blacksmiths after studying captured Italian sabers. The curved blade was ideal for cutting through enemy lines, while the hilt was designed to protect the soldier's hand from enemy weapons. The Ethiopian army also produced light artillery pieces. These were used to bombard enemy positions and break their formations. It wasn't a coincidence that Ethiopia was able to reverse engineer Italian weapons and produce their own versions. A few decades earlier, Menelik's grandfather, Emperor Tewodros II, had mandated that every able-bodied man must learn a trade. This policy ensured that there was a pool of skilled workers ready to take up the task of producing weapons. They were also taught basic military tactics and how to fight in different types of terrain. Since the new army was going to face an European power, the emperor invited foreign military advisors to help train his troops. Many Europeans who worked as advisors in Ethiopia later wrote about how impressed they were by the intelligence and fighting spirit of the Ethiopian soldiers. Here's what Italian General Oreste Salandra wrote about the Ethiopians. I must point out that the enemy has shown throughout the entire battle an energy and tenacity that must be regarded as a merit and that in my opinion far exceeded our soldiers' expectations. When Menelik ascended to the throne, he inherited a nation that was threatened by internal rebellions and external aggressions. There were armies loyal to local lords, but those armies were very small and didn't have any real military training. Also, they weren't centralized, so the emperor couldn't just call them up when he needed them. In order to create a national army, the first thing he did was to send messengers across the country calling for able-bodied men to come to the capital and join the army. The response was overwhelming as thousands upon thousands of men showed up. After selecting the strongest and most intelligent men, Menelik created a regular army with a standing force of 100,000 soldiers. He then divided his army into 6 corps numbering from 1 to 6. Each corps consisted of 4 divisions, which were again subdivided into smaller units. This reorganization helped to centralize the military and make it more efficient. He also replaced the old feudal system of promotion with a merit-based system. Soldiers were now promoted based on their performance and bravery in battle rather than their social status. For example, a commoner could become a general if he was brave and skillful in battle, while a prince would be demoted if he proved himself to be a coward. Under this new system, soldiers were paid monthly salaries and given housing allowances. Also, the army became more racially integrated because soldiers from all over Ethiopia were brought together under the banner of the Ethiopian Empire. The external aggression came from the Italians, who had established a small colony in the Eritrean coast. The Italians wanted more territory, and so they sent an army to conquer Ethiopia. Menelik knew that his army wasn't strong enough to defeat the Italians right away, so he spent 7 years modernizing his military. His objective was to create an army that was bigger, better trained, and better equipped than the Italian army. And in this video, we'll be looking at the 3 ways Menelik modernized his army. When Menelik came to power, there were no national armies in Ethiopia. Menelik's second step towards creating a modern army was to set up military training camps. The third way the emperor prepared his troops was by equipping them with modern weapons. Now, it wasn't only Menelik's military that was preparing for war. The Italian invasion force was composed of 2 main components, the Blackshirts and the Askari. The Italians' plan for conquering Ethiopia was simple. They were going to march across the country and capture the major cities. After the battle, the Italians regrouped and made a second attempt to invade Ethiopia. This time, their army was much larger, numbering around 17,000 men. The Italians were confident that this time they would be successful. However, they once again met fierce resistance from the Ethiopian army. The Italians were defeated and forced to retreat. After suffering two defeats, the Italians regrouped once again and prepared for a third invasion of Ethiopia. This time, their army was even larger, numbering around 20,000 men. The Italians were confident that this time they would be successful. However, they once again met fierce resistance from the Ethiopian army. The Italians were defeated and forced to retreat. By the time the Italians had launched their third invasion of Ethiopia, Emperor Menelik had already prepared his troops, and the Ethiopians were ready for them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Today, however, we are going to look at one of Italy's greatest defeats, the Battle of Adwa. The town is famous because on March 1896, the Ethiopian army defeated an invading Italian force. This event is known as the Battle of Adwa. This was most certainly true, but it was also one of the greatest defeats in the history of the Italian armed forces. However, the Italians lost between 7,000 and 10,000 men, while the Ethiopians lost around 4,000. The Italian defeat was complete. Their emperor, Menelik II, captured an enormous amount of booty, including 2 cannons, and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. However, he was later pardoned by the king. The British press was particularly savage. The following appeared in the Daily Mail: "Men of color are treacherous, cowardly, and cruel. The Italians were beaten by 100 to 1 odds by an inferior race. A black Zulu victory would be more improbable than an Italian reverse." Despite his poor performance in battle, he was not actually relieved of his command until November 1896, 7 months after the defeat at Adwa. He also took the Italian flag and paraded it through the streets of Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian capital. Like his predecessor, Mussolini had great ambitions in Africa. Over 400,000 Italian soldiers eventually took part in the campaign. The Ethiopians were once again fighting a technologically superior enemy. The Italians had tanks, aircraft, and poison gas. The Ethiopians were equipped with hunting rifles and a few light machine guns. Despite these disadvantages, the Ethiopians put up fierce resistance. Before the invasion, he had been a fairly cautious leader. The Allies invaded Sicily. By September, the island was under the control of the British and the Americans. On April 28, 1945, he was shot by Italian partisans. His body was taken to the town square in Milan and hung from a meat hook. A crowd gathered to celebrate. One woman cut off and ate a chunk of the dictator's liver. The rest of his body was burned by partisans and then buried near where he had been shot. On September 8, 1943, the Grand Council of Fascism voted for Italy's withdrawal from the war. Later that day, King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed Mussolini from his position as prime minister. The trauma of the defeat was felt by ordinary Italians and by their leaders. It is one of the reasons why Italy became an imperialist power. It is also one of the reasons why Italy's future foreign policy was dominated by a desire for revenge. After the conquest of Ethiopia, he became increasingly reckless. He invaded Albania, started a war with the Soviet Union, and eventually made the mistake of declaring war on the United States. All of these conflicts drained Italy's resources. She was heavily reliant on German support. This left Mussolini in an extremely vulnerable position. Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, appealed to the League of Nations for help. But this was rejected by Britain and France. Both countries preferred to appease Mussolini rather than risk war with Germany and Italy. He wanted to conquer Ethiopia and turn it into the center of an Italian empire. When Mussolini came to power, there was still a great deal of resentment over the defeat at Adwa. Mussolini used this to his advantage. He launched a propaganda campaign designed to glorify the veterans of the Ethiopian War. He also created the Ethiopia Siachi Commission Nero, or Ethiopia, Shirt of Black, a paramilitary organization devoted to conquering Ethiopia. Crispi was determined to make Italy into a colonial power. He envisioned an Italian empire stretching from the Red Sea in the east to Tripoli in the west. Most of the Ethiopian army was wiped out. The country was devastated by war and famine. An estimated 500,000 people died during the conflict. To get away from the jeers, he drove 200 miles away to the site of the Battle of Adwa. Here, in full view of the Ethiopian people, he ordered the execution of 200 prisoners of war. This was a clear message. Italy would never forget Adwa, but she would ensure that Ethiopia would never again defeat the Italians. Mussolini took the country's old imperial insignia, including the famous Lion of Judah, and replaced them with new ones bearing the fascist symbol of the axe and the wreath. Adwa was a disaster, but it did not stop Crispi. He fought on until 1898 when he was eventually defeated. Not only were they defeated by a non-European power, but the Ethiopians had very limited firearms. The country was deeply divided over the war in Africa. Many prominent figures, including the philosopher Benedetto Croce, opposed the conflict. They argued that Italy should focus on improving the lives of her people rather than going to war. The Italians were equipped with some of the best weapons in the world at the time. The Italian army was also better trained and they had more officers. The Ethiopians were fighting a defensive battle. This marked a return to African warfare for the Italians. However, the campaign in Libya was far from successful. Eventually, in 1915, Italy joined the conflict. She did so because she was promised territory in Austria-Hungary after the war. Italy's entry into the conflict is known as the Agresian Fiumana. This translates as the Fiume aggression. It was named after the city of Fiume, now called Rijeka. Italy promised this city to the South Slavs after the war. However, Italy went back on her word and kept the city for herself. The resulting uproar contributed to the downfall of the government of Vittorio Emanuele Orlando. By 1913, the Italians had still not defeated the Ottomans. In fact, they had lost more than 100 100,000 men to just 30,000 Ottoman losses. Yet despite these disadvantages, they won a decisive victory over the Italians. This battle had profound effects on the Italian people, their politics, and also their psyche. In fact, this defeat was so traumatic that for decades afterwards, the Italian military refused to engage in battles on the African continent. Adwa is a small town in Ethiopia. It is situated in the Ethiopian highlands about 20 miles from the Eritrea border. The Italian defeat at Adwa has been described as one of the greatest disasters in the history of Western imperialism. The battle itself was brutal. Thousands of men died. Accounts of casualties vary. There are many reasons why the Italians lost at Adwa. These include Ethiopian military preparations, the Italian decision to attack across open ground, and bad generalship by the Italians. In particular, the Italian commander, General Baratieri, was heavily criticized after the war. He was accused of being drunk during the battle. According to eyewitnesses, the general had terrible maps, which may have been intentionally misleading. He made serious blunders during the fight, such as attacking when his troops were not ready. His poor decisions led directly to the deaths of many Italian soldiers. General Baratieri was tried after the war. He was found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer. Italy's defeat at Adwa was a shock. It was the first defeat suffered by a European power against an African military force. Newspapers around the world went into overdrive. At the time of the battle, Italy was politically unstable. There were mass strikes and riots in the north. King Umberto I was assassinated by an anarchist. Despite all this opposition, the government of Prime Minister Francesco Crispi pushed ahead with the war. In 1911, Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire and invaded Libya. When World War I began, Italy remained neutral. This was very frustrating for the British and the French, who both wanted Italian support against the Central Powers. After World War I, Italy became a fascist dictatorship under Benito Mussolini. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia began in October 1935. It was a massive undertaking. The Italian victory in Ethiopia was even more devastating than their defeat at Adwa. In 1936, Mussolini visited Ethiopia to celebrate his victory. However, he was jeered by the locals. Italy's victory in Ethiopia had a profound effect on Mussolini. In 1943, things began to go badly for Italy. After his removal from power, Mussolini spent some time imprisoned by the Germans. Victor Emmanuel III died in exile in Egypt in 1947. The next year, Italy became a republic. The defeat at Adwa had profound effects on the Italian people. For decades, it haunted their national consciousness. If you want to know more about Italy's defeat at Adwa, I recommend the following book, The Italian Disaster at Adwa by Harold G. Marcus. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to subscribe, remember to like and share. You can follow me on social media. Thanks for watching.